It's Brian Preston, the money guy.
You haven't mastered debt.
This is a big one, Brian, and I think maybe this is the one that's the most apparent, that someone is not ready to be wealthy, because I would propose that wealthy folks, truly wealthy folks, don't struggle with debt.
No, of course
don't.
not.
They may use debt, but they don't have debt. It's not a struggle that they have.
Here's what I think happens that turns people, because there is a good way and a bad way to use debt, but everybody, even if you're using the debt the good way, you're scared to death of it.
That's right.
And I think the problem is the people who are using debt wrong are trying to, and the visual I get is they're trying to create what they perceive as a stable bridge to get them where they think they're eventually going. And what I mean by that, let me give you some examples. Is somebody who, like, think about we see this all the time. A medical student just makes it through their residency. They get their first big job that's paying them six figures. Even though they have over six figures of student loan debt, what do they typically do? They go out and buy a big fancy car.
Well, because they got to reward themselves.
Because they do. They have to reward themselves. But you know how they do this? They use debt.
That's right.
That's the bridge that they use because they think, hey, I'm going to be wealthy. I'm deserving of this. It's the same thing. I don't even have to pick on doctors. I could pick on a young professional.
Sure.
You get your first job. You're starting to build some income. You're making headway. What do? You go out there and you get you a big fancy apartment that you're paying rent in. You get you a big fancy car. And then, before you know it, you're not actually saving money for the future. You're not letting your army of dollar bills. And even worse, you're building debt that is turning compound interest against you. Right. You're actually, instead of this force that is so powerful that it adds exponential growth, you're actually letting that exponential growth build on you to turn you into a zombie.
And the problem is that debt is a mirage. And I'll kind of pick on credit cards for a moment here at first. They seem like they're providing a bridge for, hey, I don't have $5,000 to go take that trip or buy that thing. But you know what? I can just put it on this credit card and I'm going to be able to have that thing or have that experience, and then I'll just pay it off slowly. Well, it's not until you start going on that bridge that you recognize, oh, maybe this isn't what it was cut out to be. And so we were trying to think about, is there a really good real-world example that shows this to kind of let people know what it's like to have debt? And I was amazed that outside of me and you, our content team was not familiar with this illustration.
Well, I think it's right because where we're from, the rest of our team doesn't hang out with carnies at the traveling fairs that come through their town. Because I was very familiar. I mean, if you could see some of the really inappropriate mirrors that I had won when I was I wasn't even a teenager. I was a kid at the fair.
I know exactly what you're talking about. She has no idea.
Very inappropriate. Well, when you go, show them the slide, Bo. When you go to fairs, at least when I was growing up, and you still see these things, these Jacob ladders, where these things are a scam unless you know how to do it, is because if you notice, they're only attached in one point. Now, this carnival worker's being very nice to this young lady.
No, he's not. He's setting her up. That's what he's doing. He's not being nice. If you notice,
he's stabilizing by having an arm on there. As soon as he takes his arm off, that thing is going to start spinning around because the center of gravity is where it's at. But it's impossible. It looks like a stable bridge. That's why they collect your money. But then you get whipped around and thrown off of this ladder. And that's the way credit cards are. Exactly. If you are not paying credit cards off monthly, you are in complete failure status because they are just a sucker's bet if you're not handling that debt correctly.
Now, if you're watching this and you've never actually done a Jacob's ladder, what's really, really interesting is when you start, you're like, oh, I got this. This feels pretty good. No problem. I've got no issues. Credit card debt is the exact same way. But the further you go along, the higher up on that ladder you get, the more precarious it becomes until you just can't hold on anymore. And before you know it, you're upside down. That is a perfect illustration for debt. So if you're ready to be wealthy, you do not struggle with this. But this is what I think is really frustrating. Or not frustrating, maybe it's just interesting, Brian. The average American has almost $6,200 in credit card debt. Now, we've talked about this on shows before. What is it? 60% of Americans could not come up with $1,000 for an emergency.
That's right.
Yet, the average American is $6,200 in the hole on debt.
Yeah, and if you think about this, because there's one other stat, is that 47% of households carry this debt. So when I see the average, I mean, you know that, because here's the other stat that I had was that 60% of all credit cards carry a balance. Well, now that's not users, because here's what that means to me when I see a stat like 47% of users carry the credit card debt. That means that some of these people are carrying multiple credit cards, carrying multiple balances, and that's sad. That's not healthy use of debt, because once again, you're turning compound interest, instead of it being a force of good for you, you're turning it completely against you, and it's just hard to get out of that quicksand.
All right, so Brian, we've talked about the tool and how dangerous it is and how it can hurt you and how it can harm you. If you're somebody who listens to this show, what are some ways that we can be ready for wealth as it relates to debt? What are some ways that we can master debt? Are there rules of thumbs we can follow that will keep us in line?
Yeah, let's go through these pretty quickly. First of all, because these are the common debts that you have to worry about. Credit card debt should never exist.
That's the rule of thumb.
It just
Don't
doesn't
have
exist. You should never have credit card debt. You can use credit cards. I have no problem with credit card use, but if you ever carry a balance over to the next month, you're doing it completely wrong. That's a failure. Probably need to go somewhere much more drastic if you can't handle basic discipline. Let's talk about cars. Cars are financial napalm. These things, they're horrible. Think about it. I mean, we talk about all the things that are obstacles towards your success. We talked about credit card interest is horrible, but cars are also horrible. They hit you in multiple ways. They depreciate like a rock. When you buy a car, it is going to depreciate very rapidly. You also are going to have maintenance costs and have to put fuel. You're going to have to put tires. This thing's going to cost you money to actually use, plus insurance. And then, and it's just one of those things where as it depreciates, as it starts to break down, you're paying money. It's just an asset. It's amazing they even call it an asset. It's a use asset. It's a use asset that is costing you money to run it, as well as it's going down in value every year. So we've tried to put some guardrails up to keep you from running your financial life off the ditch because of a bad vehicle purchase. So here's what we came up with. Non-luxury brands. Because look, I think we are more flexible. We are more grace-filled than some other financial advisors and financial pundits, in the fact that we actually let you go buy a new car. Now, look, I love used cars. I think everybody always looks over that, is that if you buy a used car,
that's great.
But there are people that say, you know what, I'm tired of every used car I break having some issue that was not disclosed or some major problem that just doesn't work out. So you go buy a new car, like a dependable Honda Accord or some Toyota or something like that. We want you to use 23.8. What that means is we want you to put down 20%. You can't finance it more than 3 years amortization, and it cannot exceed 8% of your gross income. And that's for the household. So if you and your spouse have 2 cars, still 8% of your gross income.
So, Brian, you put a little interesting disclaimer on there. That's for the Hondas and the Toyotas and the Nissans of the world. You said not a luxury brand. If I'm someone who wants to buy a luxury brand, maybe I want BMW, Mercedes, Tesla, fill in the blank. What's the rule there?
Basically same as cash. So I'll give you a little grace and say, look, because some of us you'll have a bonus, you'll have a year-end distribution. So if we're talking 3, 4, 5, 6 months, I'll even give you up to 12 months grace, but it's got to be paid off, same as cash, because I don't want you faking lifestyle. That's the problem. That's what gets you in trouble with debt. Remember, you're not trying to focus on appearances. You're trying to work on building assets. So you can't do that if you have all your money going out into monthly cash flow payments.
Yeah, and when you talk about faking lifestyle, the one place that we see this all the time, too, is in housing. People get way over their skis. They buy way more house than they can afford. And then all of a sudden they find themselves in a place where they can't cover their monthly bills. So a real easy rule of thumb to use is when you go to buy a house, when you add up your principal and your interest and your taxes and your insurance, the cost of your housing should not exceed more than 25% of your gross income. If you can stay below that threshold, you're going to keep yourself in a healthy spot. If you find yourself trickling up into the 30, 35, 40% just to cover housing, you're not setting yourself up for long-term success.
Yeah, and get creative. I mean, that's the thing, is because I know we're going to get comments from people who live on the coast.
Sure.
And I know it's hard because we've all been broke. We've all been young. Look, I had roommates until I got married.
Yep.
I mean, because it's just that living in Atlanta, it was much more economical to have 2 roommates than it was to live on my own. Even though Look, I probably was the one with the annoying habits, though, being reality. I was about to throw some shade on my
On your other roommates?
but truthfully,
You're like, man, I couldn't believe it. They would never leave clothes out.
I'm the weird, quirky one that was probably, fortunately, I'm very entertaining, so it probably hopefully came over my weird habits. But the other thing I want you to do is think about having a budget. How can you create an automatic savings plan? How can you focus on having a financial plan for the future if you don't know where your dollars are going? Now, look, I've told you, and you've said it too, we don't actually personally love budgeting.
Right.
Because I like muscle memory. I like that I have a cash management plan where I'm automatically saving what I need to, when I need to, and it's going to get me where I want to be financially. But there's a lot of you guys, you don't get to muscle memory unless you actually started some hyper discipline and minimalism in the beginning. So that's why go make sure you have a budget so you can start building that habit and graduate beyond, so that once you're saving 25% and you've got all these limits in there, you can do what you need to do.
And I think another thing, Brian, you said, because we're talking about, this is the section we're talking about using debt and mastering debt. One of the reasons people use debt is they want to try to expand their lifestyle. And you use this, I don't remember when you came up with this, but you said, hey, there's nothing wrong with bedazzling your basic life. Now, I remember when my wife and I first got married, we had a house, had this little outdoor back seating area, and I couldn't afford a lot of furniture stuff. So I went and bought like some Christmas lights, and I like hung the Christmas. And you would have thought that this was like Shangri-La. I mean, it was like the nicest thing in the world. I didn't have to go buy a bunch of nice outdoor furniture and fancy. I bought some Christmas lights off Amazon, and it was amazing. And we loved sitting out there, and it was a lot of fun. So there are ways you can bedazzle your basic life without running up credit card debt.
Now I've talked about, like, I love to travel. My wife and I love to travel. We went to Italy earlier part of our marriage, and we did it cheap. I'm talking about dirt cheap. We did it where we got ripped off in every city. We're hauling our suitcase down the cobblestone roads. I mean, it was really, really done on the cheap.
But how fond are those memories?
But that's the thing, is that we know memories blossom. So, things get better over time. And truthfully, now when I talk to people about it, because I still did all the tourist stuff, when I tell the story of my trip to Italy, it has so many nuanced little stories and other little quirky things that happen. It's outstanding. We still got the great experience that's going to blossom, but we just didn't break the bank to do it. So I don't want you to think we're telling you be a tightwad, be an Ebenezer Scrooge, not enjoying life. I think you can do a lot more than you probably realize, but you can do it in a well thought out way that it lets you respect saving and building wealth in the long term.